In New York City, the day is soot-stained and the night grimly gaslit, while out west the day is bright and blue. But the night is black as sin. Out of that western night rode one man who chose the sin, the Black Rider. Accompanying that text is a full-page shot of the Black Rider, covered from head to toe in black, his face hidden beneath a bandana. He charges forward on a white horse, a rifle in one hand, the bright moon rising in the cloudy sky behind him. So opens our next issue of the Mighty Marvel Western event. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown, episode 19.12, Strange Western. Man, author Steve Englehart did such a cool job opening this comic up that I just had to recreate it here for you folks. That was just so dramatically written. Englehart might be a name that's familiar to some longtime comic readers. I know him best for his legendary runs on the Avengers in the mid-70s, crafting tales like the Avengers Defenders War and the Celestial Madonna. I haven't read those stories, mind you. I only know of them and their importance to the canon. That is how big they are. Englehart has done a bunch of other projects over the years. He launched the Defenders with Sal Buscema, adding in the character of Valkyrie to the cast. He wrote Doctor Strange, and he was the author who had the Ancient One killed, which allowed the Doctor to become the Sorcerer Supreme. He and Jim Starlin co-created Shang-Chi. He retconned the Captain America and Bucky of the 1950s Marvel Comics into being separate characters from Steve Rogers, which then allowed him to explore Steve as the disillusioned nomad, one of Captain America's most famous storylines. Englehart left Marvel for DC in 1976, which saw him reset the tone of Batman, making him a darker, more noir-inspired character with pencilers Walt Simonson and Marshall Rogers. This was basically a complete reset of how then-contemporary authors wrote Batman, much more in line with what Bob Kane and Bill Finger's original intention was. And it's a change that would hold for the next 50 years. And I could go on about his exploits as an author. Really, Englehart's history seems never-ending. But this is a good enough stopping point for now. You get the basic idea. Steve Englehart is a good floopin' author. For the era that he wrote in, he's probably one of the best. But his team-up with Marshall Rogers on Batman is a good place for us to stop, because Marshall Rogers is who drew this issue of Strange Western. Rogers was a New York City kid with an itch to draw. He studied architecture at Kent State, Ohio, knowing that it was a respectable job that his parents would approve of, but also knowing that it took drawing, which is what he really wanted to do. Rogers had a hard time getting in at Marvel and DC, though, first applying in 1972 before getting any real interest before either company in 1975. His first published interiors were on The Deadly Hands of Kung Fu, starring Misty Knight and Colleen Wing, the Daughters of the Dragon. In 1977, Rogers teamed up with Englehart for their legendary run on Batman, so it's no surprise that editor Mark Panacea paired the two of them together on today's issue. They are teamed up with Al Vey on inks, but Rogers handled the pencils and the colors on this one. He also teamed up with artist Eric Powell for the cover, which is my personal fave out of these 4 Mighty Marvel Western issues. After that adventurous, thrilling opening page, we turn the page and get the opposite. A thin, bookish man wearing a pair of glasses rides through the streets of New York. He's finely dressed in a dark striped suit, a nice red vest, and clean white leather coat and hat. His horse, also white, isn't charging forward this time. This beast walked with its head down, one leg limply held up. As he rides down the stone-lined street, a woman spots him and asks if he's lost. The man doesn't think so. "This is Westcliff, isn't it?" he asks. She confirms that it is, and the man climbs off of his horse. He introduces himself as Morris Masters, although most people call him Doc. He just got off the train from Texas, actually. This impresses the finely dressed woman. "A doctor, you say?" And she starts eyeing him up. Morris can see what she's thinking. "He's a poor doctor," he adds, "with a sick horse. He's in town to have his horse, Ichabod, looked at by a top vet, and he will be bunking with his aunt and uncle until that's done." They approach the large Westcliff building, referred to as a palazzo, and enter it. The woman, who is named Desiree, comments that Morris must not have wired ahead. Inside, they find some kind of party going on. Dozens of people mill about the great house, all of them well-dressed, chatting and drinking and snacking. Desiree gets the attention of the masters of the house, Helen and George. Helen is so glad to see Morris. He looks just like his father. Uncle George, however, comments that he needs to work on his scheduling. They're having a black tie dinner, and Morris isn't dressed for it. Chagrined, Morris is just as happy to sit this out. He'll find a quiet place to keep to himself. That's fine. But Aunt Helen insists that he get cleaned up and join them. As he exits the room, Morris notes that there are a lot of animal trophies throughout the house. Uncle George explains that safaris are all the rage these days, and this house does have lots of rooms to decorate. Over dinner, conversation takes us through Morris's life. He grew up out west in a town named after his mother, Jezebel. It wasn't anything special, but a cruel man named Luke Davis wanted the land, and so he killed Morris's father to get it. His mother died in childbirth. We're shown in a panel after Morris's birth, a man talking to his father. The stranger asks Mr. Masters if he's going to go back east now that his wife is dead, but he says no. They don't want him, so his life is here now. Morris then grew up on various ranches, doing whatever work was needed in order to survive. Everywhere he went, though, he honed his craft and practiced his aim, always planning to hunt down the man who killed his father. Eventually, he did, but after shooting Davis down in a bar, Morris was arrested for murder. Davis had friends, and those friends demanded that Morris be put on trial. But the judge knew the kind of man that Davis was, and so he let Morris suffer a probation instead of jail or death. Sympathizing with the young man, the judge offered to help Morris however he could, and Morris asked if he could become a doctor. He studied at the Universidad de Mexico, and became a doctor. There's some detail fudging going on here, but Englehart is basically keeping the broad strokes of the Black Rider's story the same. Originally, back in 1948, the Black Rider was a young man named Matthew Masters, and he was an outlaw called the Cactus Kid, easily the lamest-sounding kid nickname that we have seen so far in these books. Although I do love the alliteration of Matt Masters as a name. It just sounds good. Matt Masters. Whew. Anyways, in his original history, Matt freed a town from the criminal control of the Davis gang by killing the gang members. When the governor of Texas learned of this, he had Matt brought to him, and actually thanked him for his help. When he asked how he could repay Matt, the young man asked to become a doctor, and so he did. Doc Masters then set up shop in Leadville, Texas, and lived as peacefully as he could. However, a hired killer came to town one day, and Doc was not willing to run him off. He had his scare with violence and the law. He's done with that. The town turned on him, branding him a coward. So Masters dressed in all black and became the Black Rider, which is an interesting combination of a Western hero's origin and a superhero's origin. I believe that the family drama that Englehart has added is a new part of the character, as I see no mention of Morris's father anywhere else online, and that's something that's going to be explored in this story. I'm not sure why he got the name change from Matt Masters to Morris Masters. Maybe the Matt name was too similar to Two Gun Kid's Matt Hawk for Englehart's tastes, or Matt Murdock, and he wanted something different. And I honestly don't know of a comic book character named Morris otherwise, so, I suppose I think it's Morris Bench is Hydro Man, but Morris is a pretty underused name in the comic book world. For whatever reason, I have to admit that Matt Masters sounds like a hero's name, while Morris Masters does sound a little bit dorky to me. Sorry to any Morrises out there. The affluent guests at his relations' party don't find Morris's collegiate history to be very impressive, and he can tell. He deftly switches topics back to New York and asks why his father even left. He always said that he left because of a broken heart. Aunt Helen says that's ridiculous. He had a very respectable marriage arranged for him to the daughter of Colonel De Winter, but Morris's father had a crush on some servant girl. His father, Morris's grandfather, had the girl dismissed so as to discourage his interest. But Ned went west to find her. He must not have been too heartbroken, though, Aunt Helen says, because Morris is clearly not half Chinese. Uncle George then invites the gentleman to the parlor for brandy and cigars, but Morris excuses himself. He's been on a train for days. He wants to stretch his, and Ichabod's, legs a little bit. Morris and Ichabod explore the city, finding their way to Chinatown. As they do, Morris flashes back to his practice in Leadville. Late one night, a Chinese woman fell into his office. Like, she literally collapsed at the door. He brought her in and started to get her cleaned up. She rambled the entire time, saying that they stole her from China and brought her to New York. She managed to escape, but there are others, bad men, who make them into whores. She pulls a letter that she stole out of her shirt. The letter says that the police are cracking down. They're watching the Church of the Headless Angel, so the next shipment will be delayed. It has orders to keep the current girls alive. For now. The bottom of the letter is torn away, a signature or seal barely visible. The woman would die in his hospital. The next morning, Morris took the letter to a Chinese man that he knows. The letter at the bottom, the torn one, could be sun or maybe mountain. He can't really tell. There's just not enough there. Morris aims to find out. And now, in the present moment, the Black Rider aims to find out. Dressed for vigilantism, the rider climbs to the rooftops and takes a look around. He does, indeed, find a church with a headless angel, and he heads towards it. Along his trip, he sees a boat at the docks, and women with their wrists tied are being offloaded. Someone tries to stop the deckhands, and, when the deckhands begin to fight back, he does as well. This guy grabs them by their shirts, twists them in midair, and kicks them both in the face. He is doing kung fu. But he is still one man against a crowd, and the rider figures that he better help out. He jumps in, and they are doing all right until someone on the boat fires a gun. The Black Rider fires back and whistles for his horse. Ichabod races to the scene, and the rider jumps on with practiced ease. He offers the stranger a hand and pulls him up, and then they race off. The guys at the dock hop onto their horses. They can't let the rider and his new friend escape. They've seen too much. But Ichabod is off like a bolt of lightning and outpaces them quickly. He leaps over a tall fence, finally cutting off their pursuers. 2 minutes and 10 city blocks later, the rider finally slows. His friend, who says that his name is Yao, hops off of Ichabod and asks why this man is getting involved. He is trying to stop the whore trade. What is the rider doing here? He clearly isn't from around here. The rider pulls out the letter that he was given in Texas. This is why he's here. He explains where it came from and then hands it off to Yao. Yao notes that the signature is torn, but he's seen it before. He draws it in the dirt and explains that it means the sun setting beyond the mountains. It means Western Cliff, or West Cliff. And the Black Rider's eyes go wide. He races off, and his thoughts flash back to his old life in Leadville. We see him training his horse to act demure and broken down. After all, Doc Masters is a normal, small-town doctor, and he doesn't want anyone to think that he was that young killer, Morris Masters. But unfortunately, that was not enough to keep him hidden. Another ruffian, this time Blast Burroughs and his gang, passed through town. An old man informed Masters that they were planning to drive another man off of his claim. Or kill him. And probably kill him. The old man eyes Masters. Unless somebody does something about it. Masters swore to a good man that he would never kill. And, in his mind, he adds again. But doesn't a doctor have a duty to protect life? To prevent a man from dying? That night, Masters made his choice. Putting on the black clothing transforms him into someone else. He is no longer Doc Masters or Morris Masters. He's the Black Rider. He went out to Ichabod and told him to act normal. Tonight, their masquerade is over. They are riding the plains like they used to, Satan. It's time to kill once again. The horse's name is Satan. That's... I can't... Like, look, there's something absolutely ridiculous. Like, I would never in my life purchase a horse and be like, wow, this horse is fast. What's a good name for it? Satan. It's just... It's dramatic AF. So we return to New York, and the Black Rider returns to his family home of Westcliff. He finds Uncle George first, and then threatens him with his guns. Tell him about the whores, or he will ventilate George. The old man stammers, It's not his gang. Before he can say any more, Aunt Helen aims a rifle at the back of the rider's head. She'll handle this, like she's handled everything else. So how did he find them? Did he follow Morris here from Leadville? The rider claims to not even know who Morris is. He came here following the seal on a stolen letter. George angrily points at Helen. He told her that using the seal would be trouble. Oh, please, she says. How many men can connect a Chinese seal to a mansion in New York City? Her father used the seal for years. Why shouldn't she? While they're distracted by their argument, the rider kicks backwards at Aunt Helen. Her gun is knocked aside, and it discharges. He then spins and pushes the barrel away from him, and she fires again, missing. During the struggle, George races to grab a gun from a nearby table. But the rider is younger and faster, and having now wrestled the gun away from Helen, he cracks the old man in the face. With George down, the rider turns back to Aunt Helen. But she's gone. A nearby row of bookcases contains a hidden passageway, and one of them is pulled open. The rider puts down his family's rifle and draws his own pistols before descending the stairway. This is why Father left for Texas, he thinks. They sent the girl that he was sweet on there to be a whore. The Black Rider moves carefully down a hallway before reaching a large, 2-story command center. A cauldron is suspended above the center on chains, and a whipping post is set up below it. A massive stone relief of the Chinese character for Westcliff hangs on the wall. Suddenly, the rider freezes. He hears something, but he can relax. That's Satan's walk. The white horse enters the room from another passageway, and the rider is glad to see him. If he's here, then Helen must have opened another door in order to escape. Hurry, Satan! There's no time to waste! The rider hops on, and they take off down the hall that Satan appeared from. God, I cannot get over calling this horse Satan. The passageway opens up into the wilderness surrounding New York City. Trees, bushes, and a rocky landscape have slowed Aunt Helen down, and Satan is catching up. She actually curses him, saying, "That horse runs like the devil," which actually makes his name make a lot more sense to me now. Aunt Helen is on her own horse, dodging through the woods. In her head, she narrates that she was the one who killed all of the animals in the manor house, so she can kill one damn cowboy. Helen races ahead, draws another rifle from her saddle, and then climbs up on a rock, setting up a shot. She uses the rock to stabilize her aim. She waits for the rider to get in range. She waits, and then she fires. The rider falls from Satan, going to the right while the horse dodges left. Helen can't see him in the shadows, but she's just gonna kill anything that moves. She fires again and again, only stopping when a pistol is pressed to the back of her head. The rider tells her to drop the gun. He steps back as she does. No sense letting her close. He made that mistake once before. He then pulls down his mask, saying that he knows how to play this game better than she does. Helen actually laughs at this reveal. Well, he certainly did. Hell, he takes more after her than his own father. But get this, Morris. She's rich. She'll never even touch a prison. What can he do? Morris pulls the mask back up over his face. He trained his horse to act like a nag before he ever thought of becoming the Black Rider. Why would he do that? He can only think of one reason. He's crazy. He just hasn't been right since the day that his father died. Died because of her actions. He says that he owes a good man, the judge, and that's why the Black Rider deals in justice. He points both of his guns at Aunt Helen. Her eyes go wide. Morris, no, you can't. I'm your flesh and blood. The Black Rider opens fire, shouting, Black Rider justice! The deed done, the rider pulls his guns up. Unseen in the shadows is the man that he met earlier, Yao. Between panels we see Yao age. His black goatee turns white, his face is lined with wrinkles, and his clothing changes too. We are now in Marvel's 1970s, and we see the Ancient One lost in thought, floating a foot off of the ground, inside Bleecker Street Mansion. Doctor Strange and his wife, Clea, enter the pleasant sitting room in casual robes, apologizing for disturbing his meditation. The Ancient One corrects his pupil. He wasn't meditating, just remembering. Another doctor at another time. He and I and others share a destiny, he says. And the story ends. This story is a bit all over the place. But I have to say, overall, I enjoy this. I think the basic story here is solid. I think it's well presented. Englehart does a lot of work in this, and it does tell a complete story. That stuff is all solid. I do not think that the sum of the parts is greater than the whole, however. Englehart works several flashbacks into our modern narrative, most of them used to explain the origin of the Black Rider. As someone who has never read about this character before, that's incredibly useful and it's really appreciated. So far, the other Western story that we've seen here, Kid Colt and the Arizona Girl, didn't provide any kind of origin or backstory or explanation for those characters almost at all, other than Annie commenting that Kid Colt killed the man who killed his father. So, again, I really like the fact that Englehart works that into this narrative. However, in one of those flashbacks, Englehart does have Morris training his horse to act like a nag, before becoming the Black Rider. His explanation of, I'm crazy, at the end of this, just does not work for me. Morris has been a relatively normal human being in this story, other than, being a costume crime fighter. And why would somebody feel the need to train your horse to be quiet and sad-looking? Even the idea that he wants to start over now that he's a doctor doesn't really cover that for me. Why train your horse to act differently, but not change your name? Hell, Morris even moves towns. He grew up in Jezebel and then operates out of Leadville as a doctor. Who would know you here? Englehart tries to explain that behavior with the I'm crazy line, and that's just weak writing. I would rather, honestly, that he didn't explain it at all. Then I would just be asking, why did Morris train his horse? I don't know, he just did. I can't argue that. I can question it, sure, but I can't argue that it happened. The flashback with the Chinese woman bothers me as well. It's well established in the story that Morris lives in Leadville, Texas, and yet his family is set up in New York City, which is fine. But you're telling me that this woman escaped their sex prison in New York City, traveled days to Texas, and delivered a letter to the only doctor in town who just happens to be related to the traffickers? Why would she not go to the police? The letter even states that the police are cracking down on them, so then go to the police! This woman would have had to buy a train ticket, travel to Texas, and then stumble into Doc Masters' place, passing tons of doctors along the way on this trip before finally getting there and then dying. From a behavioral standpoint, that just doesn't make any flippin' sense. And reading the story, I'll admit that Englehart keeps things moving quickly enough that you don't really get a chance to think about it. You wouldn't notice it unless you're sitting here picking things apart like I am. Marshall Rogers does a neat artistic trick with the flashbacks that I do appreciate. The majority of Rogers' panels in this comic are your standard straight-lined, square, or rectangular panels. He does mix things up with action shots, and I'll get there, but the flashbacks that were shown have these jagged, rough edges. They feel separate and differentiated from the rest of the panels, which is great, because Englehart has modern panels and flashback panels mixed together on some of these pages. When the writer is investigating the Headless Church, we see the flashback running concurrently to the modern events, which would be really confusing if the panels were all shaped the same, so that is very nice. Like I said earlier, Rogers does mix up the panel shapes and sizes for action scenes. During the initial meeting with Yao, Rogers actually uses a lot of slanted panels. Things get real triangular for that page. And when the writer clocks his uncle in the face, the writer is actually panel-less. He is stretched across the top of the image. So you start at the left of the page and you see the writer. The action extends along the gun, which is hitting his uncle in the face, and then it ends at his uncle's face. But his uncle's face is not shown within that same panel. It actually gets its own panel, which is a circle that is zoomed in really close, and it shows a much more powerful impact. I would bet that Rogers ran out of panel drawing the writer and the sweep of his attack, so the uncle technically wouldn't fit in, and it forced him to do this panel workaround. But it's still a really nice way to highlight the impact of that hit by showing us the quick zoom in. The artwork otherwise is super solid. Rogers' characters remind me quite a bit of John Severin's work. They aren't quite as well realized, I suppose would be the word, as Severin's, but Rogers does take time to shape faces and really make them differentiate from one another. His pages flow well, and his architecture is what really shines. I honestly hadn't noticed the amount of detail that he puts into the buildings or into the backgrounds, but once I learned that Rogers had trained to be an architect, those things really popped out to me so much more. The building shots in this look super detailed and well done, and it's clear that he cared about the artistry of doing architecture. He just did not care about the math and the science of creating architecture. The story was colored by Rogers as well, and I do have to admit that this is a weak point for me. For the most part, the colors work, and they're fairly realistic. But there are moments of action where Rogers uses these bright greens and reds to signify the impact of a hit, and just... those moments stick out, but not really in an impactful way. No, here it feels much more jarring. When Uncle George gets smacked by the gun butt, bright red striations explode out from the butt of the gun, and it just looks weird. The coloring here has a few sharp, sudden dips in its overall quality, but for the most part, it does work. It's mostly dark, it fits the mood, and it feels fairly realistic to me. Perhaps the most interesting thing overall here is the Black Rider himself. He is both an outlaw cowboy, setting out to right a wrong by operating outside of the law, and he's a bit of a superhero, but not in the same way that the other Western heroes have been. He reads more like Daredevil, or the Punisher, or maybe Moon Knight. This is a guy who is half off of his rocker, and he weaponizes it. He justifies killing people by putting on a mask and a costume, he trained his flooping horse to walk differently, and when he confronts his aunt, he even tells her that he's crazy. Guys like Kid Colt or the Rawhide Kid might have their individual moments of darkness, struggling with the act of murder, and they justify it by saying that they are doing the right thing in the moment. The Black Rider doesn't struggle with murder. He knows what he is doing, but he doesn't care, and he doesn't attempt to moralize it either. It really feels like there is a darkness to this character that the other books don't explore at all, and I find that fascinating. Oh, there is a fun little Easter egg during one of the flashbacks, by the way. We can actually see Kid Colt walking by Ned Masters, Morris's dad, at one point in a flashback scene. His bright red shirt and cowhide vest stand out like a sore thumb. The Doctor Strange end credits scene is a very weird story moment for me. I like seeing Yao, who would go on to become the Ancient One and train Strange, apparently, in this story as a young man, but this is not an Ancient One story. It isn't a Doctor Strange story. It's a Black Rider story. So what does that story have to do with Strange? Why would Englehart show us this? It feels like he is attempting to pitch a new story, either starring the Ancient One or Doctor Strange, within this story, and then it just never goes anywhere. It is important to note that Englehart does have history writing Doctor Strange and the Ancient One, so I can definitely understand a desire from him to return to it. I just think that it's an odd fit here in this story, which works perfectly fine without the Yao Ancient One end credits bit. Our second short story stars The Gunhawk, and a tale called The Midnight Gun by Joe E. Lansdale, artist Rafa Gars, and colorist Lee Lowridge. This story opens in a graveyard. The moon is high, casting long shadows. A gnarled, twisted tree is bent over the gravestones, and a shadowy figure waits beneath it. We see a thin man sneaking into the graveyard, a satchel over his shoulder. As he approaches the shadowy man, his walking slows. The shadow man lights a match and sucks in on a cigar. His skin is wrinkled and greenish, his eyes red. He doesn't look at the other man, but he asks him, "You looking for me?" The other guy nods nervously. "Yeah, I think so." "Well, you got it?" the shadow man asks. The other guy shifts the satchel off of his back. "Yeah," he says, "I stole him from a crib." He sets the sack down, and something cries inside of it. The shadow man exhales smoke. "Nice. You know what I like, and I know what you want. To be the fastest gun." Our main character nods. "Yeah, he heard if you did everything right like he just did, then this guy will grant him a wish." "Oh no," the shadow man replies, shaking a finger. "I don't have to do anything. I can choose to grant you a wish, and I want more than just what's in that sack." This throws the other guy. What more could you want? The shadow man exhales in his face and orders him to stick out his hand. The guy does, and the shadow man presses his cigar into the palm of his hand. He's branded now. His soul belongs to the shadow man. So he wants to be the fastest gun in the West? Well, he'll need this. The shadow man reaches into his coat and pulls out a gun. This'll make you the fastest. It never needs to be reloaded, too. But once your life is over, your soul is mine. The yokel grabs the gun. Hey, fair enough. He turns to leave, but the shadow man says one more thing. You'll only be fast at night. When questioned about this, he explains that he and the other guy have made a deal. The daytime is his, while the night belongs to the shadow man. The yokel looks at the gun. Better than nothing, I suppose. If you couldn't tell, dear listener, the shadow man is the devil, and the other guy that he refers to is God. So the yokel just sold his soul and a baby for a gun. Classy. The next day, or maybe that morning, actually, we meet our title character, the Gunhawk. He rides into town, and people give him a wide berth. He narrates, explaining that living life by the gun means that you'll hate your life. Someone is always waiting for you, and they have a gun too. You develop eyes in the back of your head, all of your senses tuning to listen for the clink of a gun hammer. Somebody always thinks that they're faster, or at least they want to be. Gunhawk enters a saloon and sidles up to the bar. He doesn't want any trouble, but it shows up anyways. A stranger stands behind him and cocks the hammer of their gun. They draw, they fire twice, and Gunhawk spins, returning 2 shots of his own. The gunman who tried to kill him falls over, a bullet hole in his forehead. The sheriff arrives soon after. The bartender says that Buck, our dead man, drew and fired first. Gunhawk didn't have a choice. The sheriff still doesn't look happy, and he tells Gunhawk to step outside. Once they're out of earshot of the crowd, the sheriff says that he knows who the Gunhawk is, and he's got papers on him. If Buck had been faster, then this whole mess would have been a lot easier, because the sheriff knows that he can't take the Gunhawk, so he wants him to leave town as soon as he can. Gunhawk sometimes wishes that they, meaning those who come after him, were faster too. All he wants is a night's rest, and he'll be gone in the morning. As he walks away, he quickly adds, "Hey, Sheriff, I can hear your hand on your gun." And the sheriff quickly jerks his hand away. So our author Lansdale has established a few things here. The first is the Gunhawk's skill level. He isn't just a fast draw, although he is that, but his senses are so trained by his lifestyle that he can hear the hammer click of a gun, or a sheriff's hand resting on the pommel of his gun. He is so skilled as to be supernatural. He is also kind of sick of it. Gunhawk is constantly tested by other gunmen, some hoping to take the fortune that killing him might bring, others wanting the fame, some of them maybe just revenge. And that's a burden. He cannot ever relax, because then it could cost him his life. And sometimes he just gets tired of it, and maybe he thinks that it would be easier to just let them win. Not that he will, but sometimes, maybe. And we've got a rando with a gun from the devil in this story, so you better believe that he's coming. Gunhawk posts up across the street from the bar, his feet propped up on a windowsill, giving him a front row seat. We see our bargain hunter yokel enter the bar, and he demands a beer. Another patron, a skinny, blonde, ugly guy, asks if his mama knows he's here, joking about his age. But our guy, the kid, asks if Skinny wants a hole in the head. He wants a beer, so give him a beer. All right, Skinny says, I didn't mean anything by it. He offers to even pay for the beer. Save the shooting for the Gunhawk, he says. The yokel scoffs. The Gunhawk? He was here? Skinny nods. This very bar. Killed a man, too. He was the fastest shooter that Skinny ever seen. The yokel's hackles are raised now. He could take the Gunhawk. No one is a faster shot than he is. He could take him. The other bar patrons start to place bets on that, and the kid marches out of the bar. Once outside, he tests his speed really quickly, drawing the gun in a blink. Yeah, oh yeah, nobody can beat that. Then he walks out into the street and fires off a shot into the air. Gunhawk! I'm calling you out, he shouts. Inside the hotel, Gunhawk watches this idiot. He could just let him be a coward for a night, just one night. Let this kid be the fastest gun in the West for once. But it's just not in him. He grabs his gun belt and joins the kid in the street. They square off, and the kid draws and fires first. His 2 shots go wide, streaking over Gunhawk's shoulder. His 3rd shot bounces between Gunhawk's legs. And finally, the Gunhawk returns fire. And the Gunhawk doesn't miss, hitting the kid right in the chest. He drops the gun and doubles over, confused. How? He was the fastest. Yeah, you were, Gunhawk says as he walks up. But you couldn't aim at all. Being fast don't mean anything if you can't hit your target. Gunhawk picks up the gun and then walks away. As the sun rises, we see the ghostly form of the kid walking back into the cemetery from the start of the story, and the Shadow Man is waiting for him. He lights another cigar and inhales. Well, that didn't take long. And later on in the day, the Gunhawk is riding past a river, and he chucks the kid's gun in. His well-honed instincts have served him well again, warning him that that gun is no good. The story ends with the gun sinking to the bottom of the river. I like this. In a book called Strange Western, this is the only story we get that is actually, honestly, strange. Weird westerns have become a thing in modern comics, meaning westerns with supernatural or horror elements to them. Oni Press's The Sixth Gun is a great example of a weird western, and it's a personal fave. But the Black Rider story is honestly a crime story, and our next 2 are fairly straightforward criminals doing stuff in the West kinds of stories. The Midnight Gun has the devil, a magical gun, and your classic monkey paws style twist to that superpowered gun. Sure, the gun makes our poor kid fast, but only at night, and while he is fast, he is not a good shot, so his overconfidence leads to him getting killed. It is honestly hard to root for this kid because we see him deliver a baby to the devil in the first 2 pages of the story, but I won't deny I do sympathize with his desire to be more. to be somebody. We don't even know his name in this story. That's how unimportant he is. He wants to be the fastest gun in the West because then he'll be legendary. And if he's able to beat the Gunhawk, whew, he will cement that legend forever. And we see the cost of that fame that he wants reflected in the Gunhawk, for whom that legend is a burden. Sure, he is famous and he is well known, but that just means that people are constantly challenging him and he is fighting for his life all of the time. The very thing that the kid wants is the very thing that the Gunhawk is tired of. But releasing that burden means dying, and the Gunhawk just can't do that. And, as we see, the kid isn't skilled enough to take the title from Gunhawk. For an 8-page comic, Lansdale crafts one hell of a story. There's surprising depth here given how little we know about the two men involved. We aren't even told the yokel's name, like I mentioned, or Gunhawk's name, but honestly, it's not their names that are important. What's important is what they represent to each other, and Lansdale gets a lot out of that. He is an experienced writer, not only writing horror and Western books, but he also wrote for Batman the Animated Series and Superman the Animated Series, so he's got some comic book chops. Artist Rafa Godders has a very dark art style in this. Everything is sharp and jagged, his characters are very thin and lanky. It makes me think of Mike Mignola's artwork from Hellboy, but just a little bit less refined. He absolutely sells the dark, haunted mood of this story. He does a really good job. I thoroughly enjoyed this story. This satisfied. We have two more classic Western stories at the end, though, both of them by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. The first features the Rawhide Kid in The Bat Strikes. The Rawhide Kid rides into another small Western town, and people scatter at the sight of him. This feels odd, and as Rawhide continues to move, he hears more whispers. Someone says that they probably know the identity of the Bat now. Another agrees. Yeah, they should have figured that a bank robber as slick as the Bat was somebody as dangerous as the Rawhide Kid. The kid finally stops to ask some questions, but when he does, everybody books it. Fed up, he finally grabs someone by the collar, but another man steps in. This is Seth Wilson, a tall, broad-shouldered slab of a man. He's taller than Rawhide, and he won't let this kind of trouble last in his town. Look, all I want to know, Rawhide says, is where the bank is. Oh yeah? Wilson replies. That sounds like something the Bat would say, I reckon. You looking to rob another bank, Bat? That is it. Rawhide has finally had enough of this crap. He stomps on Wilson's foot, punches him in the gut, and then uppercuts him, laying Wilson out. He has never even heard of this Bat fella, but if he was the Bat, then it would take someone faster than Wilson to beat him. About 10 minutes later, Rawhide finally arrives at the house of the president of the bank. The president and the town sheriff are both there enjoying a meal. They are outraged to see someone as notorious as the Rawhide Kid walk in, and they demand that he leaves. But Rawhide won't go. He would like to deposit some money, but he can't seem to get directions to the bank, thank you. So this was his next best idea. He holds out a satchel to the president, his deposit. Here you go. But the president shakes his head. His bank will not accept money from a man of Rawhide's reputation. The sheriff adds that, as far as they know, he is the Bat, and he just wants to rob their bank now. The president's wife and daughter chime in, basically trying to get Rawhide to leave. That is when Seth Wilson, who is engaged to the president's daughter, barges in and tells Rawhide to get. Well, Rawhide knows when it's time to go. He takes off his hat and bows, sarcastically thanking them for the hospitality that they showed a stranger. He leaves, deciding to deposit his money in some other town. He does stop for something to eat, upset that these people think that he could be this unsavory Bat character. So, he decides to do something about it. He stands up, ready for action, and Seth Wilson enters the bar. He declares that Rawhide is the Bat. He knows it, and he's going to stop him right here. "Well, floopin' fine," Rawhide says. "Slap leather, Wilson!" The kid draws in the blink of an eye and fires twice, hitting just Wilson's guns out of his hands. Rawhide then tears out of the saloon, eager to do something now. And wouldn't you know it, there's the bat! He is a simple man, dressed in green clothing with what looks like a sack over his head. He panics when he sees the Rawhide Kid and gets his horse moving. Rawhide figures that the bat must have robbed the bank now, so that the town would blame it on him, and he won't have that. Rawhide climbs on top of his own horse, Nightwind, and they follow. The bat tries to jump a small chasm, and his horse lands wrong, throwing him from the saddle. He runs into some nearby rocks, leaden down with the money bags. As he climbs, he upsets a mountain lion, and it pounces at him. The bat is driven back over a cliff's edge. Rawhide runs to the body, noting that somehow it is still breathing. He pulls off the bat's mask, revealing Mr. Harper, the bank president. Choking on blood, Harper tells Rawhide to tell his family that he's sorry. The bank was losing money, so he stole from it in order to cover the losses. He was a fool. And then he passes. Behind Rawhide, Seth Wilson rides up quietly. He followed Rawhide after he left the saloon, and he saw everything. He owes the kid an apology. But Rawhide tells him not to bother. Harper's wife and daughter love him. This town loved him. So tell them that he was the bat, and that Harper died running him out of town. Wilson nods. This is a mighty kind thing that he's doing. As Rawhide rides off, Wilson swears to himself that someday he will tell the true story of what happened here. People will come to tip their hats when they mention the Rawhide Kid. Last episode, when we spoke about the Lee and Kirby stories, I believed I called the first one kind of dumb. And I have to say, this one is kind of dumb. I'm fine with the Rawhide Kid being I'm fine with Rawhide being mistaken for a bank-robbing criminal. We, as the audience, know that Rawhide is the star of a comic book. He's the good guy. But the peoples of the American West don't know that. They know that Rawhide rides around randomly, that he is associated with trouble, and that no one seems to be able to stop him. Why wouldn't he be a bank robber, to boot? So that part of the story is fine with me. But Rawhide's reaction to the town is honestly what gets me. He doesn't ask them what's going on or what he's being accused of at all. And when he is confronted by someone, Seth Wilson, he doesn't actually act, helpful at all. Rather than demonstrate that he isn't a threat, he actually beats the crap out of Wilson and then leaves him eating dirt. How is that going to help your case, kid? You're upset that the people are judging you based on actions you didn't do, and then the first thing you do in town is beat up the local hero? Nice, I guess that gives them something else to judge you on, but that just feels like you're proving them right. There's also... one of the things that bothers me is Rawhide's overall story in this. He shows up to town, he's accused of a deed that he didn't commit, and when he confronts the people in charge, ostensibly the people who could cut through this rumor nonsense, they don't believe him, which is fine. He gets angry, and that's fine. That all works. But now, pissed off, he goes to have lunch, and he's so upset during lunch that he just stands up in the middle of it and leaves, deciding to do something about the bat. That's just such an odd story beat. This story isn't building to a final confrontation with the bat. It's like it's stuttering and stopping, and then finally it just ends. This story would have worked better if Rawhide got to the actual bank and then tried to deposit his money, only to be turned away by the president. Maybe they could have even had Seth Wilson visiting with Harper's daughter, like maybe she was dropping off his lunch or something, and then Wilson is the one who throws Rawhide out. So you still have the early comic action scene that probably is the reason why Seth Wilson shows up so early. And then Rawhide would decide to stake the place out and confront the bat, and then we would basically get the same ending. You know, if anything, I think that this is one of the rare comic stories that could have had less pages and actually worked better for it. I get the feeling that this is one of those stories where Kirby was the one who mostly wrote it while he was drawing, and then Stan Lee just put a script over it. It feels like Kirby threw in a couple action scenes when he wanted to do something with more pizzazz, which is why we have 3 separate confrontations with Seth Wilson. Wilson, by the way, is never presented as being a possibility for the Bat. He only ever comes off as a good guy trying to help out, so he's just a meathead lunk. And I think that's because Kirby's boundless energy just wanted those action shots in the comic. There was no greater depth or planning here. You could have easily done something where we were incriminating Seth Wilson by making him seem like he's trying to be overly confrontational with Rawhide because he's trying to cover up that he's the Bat, and then it would just be a misdirect and it's actually Mr. Harper, but that's not what happens at all. The second story is simply called The Bulletproof Man. Well, that would be quite the superpower in the American West. The story opens with a single-page image, a Jack Kirby classic, of a man holding his coat open, exposing his chest. He is fully dressed, he is just leaving himself open. This is... Cack Clug, the Bulletproof Man, and he encourages someone to shoot him. In the foreground, we have a 6-shooter held in a shaky hand, aimed at this man. And in the background, we have the Rawhide Kid, a man wearing a tall black hat, and a crowd of onlookers. Rawhide is shocked. Clug really thinks that he is bulletproof. The man with the hat nods quietly. That's because he is, son. So Clug steps forward, challenging his opponent to shoot. But the guy balks. He can't do it. Nobody can win a gunfight against him. So this is when Clug whips out his own pistol and shoots at the man. He doesn't hit him, but he does run the guy off. Rawhide is shocked at this display. The guy who ran away had Clug beaten on the draw by a mile, so why did he fumble? The man in the tall hat explains. Plenty of men have tried to shoot Cack Clug, and he definitely isn't the fastest draw that there is. But in every shootout that Clug has been in, the other man draws and fires, and his bullets just don't hit. Clug can then draw at his leisure and fire back. He has beaten the fastest guns in these parts, and no one man is able to stop him, because he's bulletproof. Rawhide knows that such a thing is impossible, but the Hat Man gestures to Clug. Find out for yourself. Confident after his latest victory, Clug walks up to a woman in a nice red dress, Mary Jones, and he greets her, complimenting her fine looks. Her father is with her, though, and he's not going to let a rascal like Clug near his daughter. Clug tells the old man to shut up, and he shoves him over. Rawhide interjects here, kicking Clug in the butt in order to knock him over. Well, the Rawhide Kid himself. So you think you can beat the Bulletproof Man? Clug stands and claps Rawhide on the shoulder. Tell you what, I'm going to go have a drink, and when I'm done, we'll have ourselves a little shootout. How about that? While Clug is gone, a group of onlookers try to talk Rawhide out of it. But instead, he asks if they know anything about Clug. They don't know much, but they know that he came from back east. They figured that maybe he used to be part of the circus, or maybe he's a magician. Rawhide doesn't learn much before Clug waddles his way back out into the street. Well, did you pray, mister? He asks. Rawhide sneers. Just draw and shoot. I am sick of looking at your ugly face. Insulted, Clug does indeed draw, but Rawhide suddenly whips out a lasso. He snags the gun and tosses it aside before rushing in to beat the tar out of the big man. Clug might be bulletproof, he says, but he sure ain't fist-proof. The crowd are amazed at Rawhide's skills and closes in. He has something else to show them, too. He pulls off his gun belt and shows them the shells that decorate its outside. Clug wasn't bulletproof. He was a pickpocket. He would get close to a man, swap his bullets out for blanks, and then challenge them to a gunfight. Rawhide confidently states that there aren't any pickpockets out west. So when he heard that Clug came from the east, he figured out his secret quickly. The adventure brought to a close, the Rawhide Kid rides off on his horse, Nightwind, and the story ends. Hooray for everybody. All of these classic Western stories are short. The story featuring the Bat was maybe 8 pages. This one, with the Bulletproof Man, maybe 7. That's pretty short for any story, for any comic, from any creator, honestly. Introducing a lead character, a problem, and then resolving it in such a short time while still having it look good is a real challenge. With those conditions, I think that Kirby and Lee do a decent job in these stories. A decent job. Because this story has problems. First off, the idea that there are no pickpockets in the American West is laughable. I'm not saying that there were a plague of pickpockets or that they were commonplace, but I'm confident that they existed. Clearly, we have Clug who headed west in this very story, and if one man could do it, then I'm sure another man could too. So the Rawhide Kid stating, with utmost confidence, that there are no pickpockets in the West, just baffles my mind. This is one of those moments where I have to remind myself that Kirby and Lee were both New Yorkers, writing this story with little research or time, and no idea of what living in the 1800s was actually like. They are, effectively, just making
No swearing.
Up. Secondly, even if you accept the questionable reality that pickpockets were uncommon in the American West, I find it hard to believe that a pickpocket could be so good at their craft that they could swap all of the bullets on a gunman's belt with blanks in just a moment. In fact, when Clug challenges Rawhide, we see him clap both of his hands on Rawhide's shoulders. They don't even come close to his hips. And what about the bullets that are in Rawhide's guns to begin with? I think the basic idea for the story works, that of a con man swapping the bullets and tricking his opponents. But I do think that it's something that would have had to happen overnight, like maybe Clug could sneak into Rawhide's room and then swap the bullets, and then they would do their shootout the next day. When I saw the title and Clug exposing his torso, I honestly thought that he was just going to be wearing, like, metal armor under his shirt or something. Like, Clug is a big barrel of a man, and you could easily have, like, a metal barrel piece under his shirt, but that is not the case. Otherwise, Kirby and Lee make Clug sound stupid. Just, God, his name, Cook Clug, like, that is some solid, we want you to hate this guy style naming, and he does look like a bad guy. He is a big, wide guy wearing green and purple with an ugly face. He looks like a beaten toad, facially. And, of course, he is a cocky Subanovich at the beginning of the story. You want to dislike him, but you don't really have a good reason. So the creators then have him creeping on Mary Jones, despite him having been warned about talking to her by her father. Ignoring her father's possessiveness, Mary Jones doesn't look thrilled to see Clug either, so now we have a valid reason to dislike him. And then Rawhide figures out his deal, defeats him fairly creatively, credit where it's due, and then the story ends. It's not fancy, but it works. And again, for a 7-page backup story in a 48-page comic, this works fine. It's, like I said, it's decent. It's not great. It's not going to blow me away. This is certainly not something that I would have rushed to the newsstand in 1948 to try and buy. But as a story sprinkle on top of this delicious comic book cupcake, I do think that it works fine. Before this episode wraps up, everybody, I wanted to give a quick special shout out to Syntonizer Productions, a YouTube channel that is basically the channel that I got the sound effects for this episode. All of the gunshot sound effects that you heard came from their channel. So I just want to say thank you for making those sound effects available for people to use. It was a huge bit of nerd research, but I actually had quite a bit of fun going through Strange Western and trying to identify the guns that were used versus the gun sound effects that Syntonizer had available and mash them up as best I could. So there's one moment towards the end where you'll hear 2 different gunshots when the Black Rider is shooting his aunt. And it's because he specifically draws 2 different pistols. So I tried to find as close to an analog as I could for that and represent it accurately within the story itself. So again, special thanks to those guys. I had a lot of fun doing the sound effect editing on this one. It was a little difficult and kind of challenging, and that's kind of something that I've been looking for in these episodes. So thank you again. I hope you folks enjoyed them. Next week, the Two Gun Kid returns, and he better have some silver bullets in our lead story. Then we'll meet Hugo, the West's smallest cowboy, and in our 4-part classic story, The Rawhide Kid, we'll meet the Living Totem. Join me in a week for Comic Book Breakdown, episode 19.13, Two Gun Kid.
Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.